Boldwood presents A Winter's Wish for the Cornish Midwife, written by Jo Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Mum needs to know if she should tell people we're having the list at Debenhams or John Lewis. Aaron's tone was every bit as urgent as his text message had suggested when Toni had opened it. "Ring me now!" All in caps. It had sounded important, and maybe it was to Aaron, but Toni was already drumming her fingers impatiently on the desk. They were childhood sweethearts, and he'd known her whole life, yet somehow he still didn't seem to know her well enough to realize that this definitely wasn't something she considered to be a priority. "You asked me to ring you urgently in the middle of my shift to decide which shop we want our gift list at?" They hadn't even had their engagement party yet, and they were already being railroaded into choosing what pattern they wanted to stare at over breakfast and dinner every day for the rest of their lives. Just the thought was like a band tightening around Toni's chest. And the fact it was obvious Aaron's mother was pushing her agenda again made her jaw ache. Twice in the last week alone, Aaron had woken Toni up and told her she was grinding her teeth. She'd wanted to tell him that it was her body's way of letting go of a bit of the tension after 7 years of his mother calling all the shots. Except if she said what she wanted to, there'd be no going back. Sometimes she wasn't even sure that would be a bad thing. But if she turned around and told someone with MS that she wasn't going to dance to their tune anymore, Toni would instantly earn the title of the worst person in the world. For most of the last 7 years, she'd have agreed with anyone who said that. When Judy, Aaron's mum, had first been diagnosed, just before the two of them had been about to head off and see the world after 2 years of saving every penny they'd earned, he hadn't even needed to ask her to put their plans on hold. It had been Toni who'd said they absolutely couldn't go. Not when Aaron's whole world had been turned upside down and his mother was still reeling from the news. They decided not to take a gap year to travel before uni. So this had always been the plan. Working like crazy in the 2 years that followed graduation to save enough money to spend 6 months seeing the world before they found themselves in the stranglehold of a mortgage. She'd been happy to put the plan on hold, but 1 year had turned into 5, and then they'd just stopped talking about it at all. She'd been about to broach it again and had come up with a plan to make sure it would happen this time. They had a mortgage now, so things would have to be different, but they had a bit of a nest egg recouped to start the trip off, and the rental income from the flat would help a lot too. Port Agnes was popular with tourists all year round, and she was sure they'd have no trouble renting it out. When she'd ended up delivering the grandson of the man who owned Corenza Holidays and who rented out properties all over Port Agnes to holiday makers, she hadn't been able to resist asking the proud grandfather about the likelihood of getting a decent income from the flat as a holiday let. She rushed home from work that night, desperate to talk to Aaron about it and already buzzing at the thought of when they could start their trip. Letting herself into the flat, the last thing she'd expected to see was Aaron kneeling in the hallway, a red velvet box in his outstretched hand like a cliché of every wedding proposal she'd ever seen. For a moment, she'd been convinced he was joking, but then he'd started to speak. "I've been thinking about doing this for a while." Aaron's hand had been shaking, and she still wasn't sure, looking back, if it was because he was nervous or because he'd been waiting for her to get home from work, kneeling in the hallway for God knows how long. "We don't need to do this. We're fine as we are." It probably wasn't the sentence that anyone offering up a proposal wanted to hear, but she hadn't been able to stop herself. She didn't want to get married to Aaron, or anyone, not yet. "Maybe we don't need to do it, but I want to do it, and I don't want to wait anymore. It's not like we've only been together for a few months." "Exactly, so what's the rush?" Even as she asked the question, the look on his face had been answer enough. It wasn't Aaron that desperately wanted to arrange a wedding. He was doing this for Judy. "When Mum had her latest relapse, she told me she couldn't bear the thought of dying and not seeing me married or meeting her grandkids." "So you're proposing to me because your mum told you to?" She hadn't been able to stop the laughter, but it had sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I think this might rank as the least romantic proposal of all time." "It's not like that, sweetheart, and you know it." Aaron had got up at that point and wrapped his arms around her. Even as she tried to stay mad at him, she'd known she couldn't. All he ever wanted to do was make everyone else happy. He spent half his life juggling his mother's needs with trying to have a life of his own, and those were just the demands Toni knew about. It was impossible to stay angry at Aaron, and he was the best friend she'd ever had, the best friend she was ever going to have. It was just that sometimes she had a horrible feeling it was all they were now, and that whatever else it was they'd had before had been lost along the way. "I'm just not sure now's the right time for all of this. Please don't turn me down." His eyes had searched her face, and she'd found herself giving in. After all, agreeing to marry him didn't mean they had to run down the aisle the next day, did it? Or even the next year, come to that. But she hadn't reckoned on Judy having a hand in every decision about the wedding right from the very start. When Toni had opened the little red velvet box the ring had been in, it was exactly as she had pictured it, because she'd seen it hundreds of times, on the third finger of Aaron's grandmother's left hand. When she died, Judy had given the ring to Aaron with the instruction to use it when he proposed. It wasn't a suggestion, but then it never really was with Judy. Even before she got ill, she'd been domineering, not wanting to loosen the apron strings she had firmly tied to her only son. But the illness had almost given her free rein and, as crazy as it was to even think it, sometimes Toni wondered if Judy actually enjoyed being able to play that card. Even before Aaron had taken to doing everything his mother asked, the proposal had always been a question of when, not if, as far as both of their families were concerned. Toni's mother had met Aaron's mother at a parent and toddler group in the village hall, and by the time their babies were a year old, the two women were best friends, and Aaron's parents had moved into the house next door. Neither Mandy or Judy went on to have other children, so Toni and Aaron were always destined to be close. The joking about them getting married had apparently started before either of them could walk. But when they'd finally shared their first kiss at 13, it had been much more of a dilemma than it should have been as to whether they took it any further. There was no chance of them having a normal, casual romance like almost every other teenage couple embarking on their first relationship. If it all went wrong, they'd still have to see each other at every family get-together, not to mention the annual holidays the two families had twice a year. It was why Toni had been trying to push down the feelings she'd had lately too. The sense of not being able to get enough air into her lungs when she thought about the wedding. It wasn't because she didn't love Aaron, she did, but she just wasn't always sure it was the sort of love that was supposed to sustain forever. And what then? What if they split two families apart one day because they couldn't make happily ever after work out? Or worse still, what if they settled for bearable ever after because they'd never known anything else and never given themselves the chance to find out? It was why she'd been so desperate to go travelling and reinstate the plans they'd had in their early 20s. Seeing the world would be great, but the truth was it was only a tiny part of the reason she'd so desperately wanted to go. They needed to test whether the route they'd mapped out for them their whole lives was the one they really wanted to take, and whether they really wanted to do it together. Except now, travelling was off the table again, and they were hurtling towards a lifelong commitment. But all she wanted was to put on the brakes just for a little while. Aaron's voice broke into her thoughts, and the struggle to breathe seemed to get all the harder. "I think Mum just wants to be able to tell people where we're having the wedding list in case anyone asks at the party tonight." Aaron's tone was gentle and patient, as it unfailingly was, but right now it made her want to scream. Toni could have counted on the fingers of one hand how often he'd raised his voice in conflict with her over the 17 years they'd been together. He was always capable of seeing someone else's point of view, which was probably why he'd decided to extend his studies with a part-time master's degree in psychology. He wanted to understand what made people tick, so he'd really be able to help them work through their problems. He just wanted to make everything right all the time, and it must have been killing him knowing he could never really make Toni and Judy happy at the same time. But he was the ultimate good guy, and he was always going to prioritise his mother's happiness now that she'd been diagnosed with MS. The trouble was, his unfailing goodness just ended up making Toni feel even more awful, as she didn't have it in her to be anywhere near as selfless as he was. 7 years felt like long enough to hold off on their dreams, but apparently it wasn't, and insisting otherwise would have made her the villain. That still didn't stop her having a 7-year itch that she just couldn't seem to soothe. With the hours Aaron was already doing as a youth worker, life was pretty full on. There were times when, despite sharing a sunny third-floor flat in Port Agnes, they barely saw each other at all. For at least 2 weeks, Toni had been looking for the perfect opportunity to talk to Aaron about the wedding, about slowing down the juggernaut they'd released the handbrake on. She had the germ of an idea for a solution, something that would give them both a bit of space to make sure this was what they really wanted and that they weren't just doing what was expected. She needed to find a way of putting it to Aaron, but the right moment just hadn't presented itself yet. This definitely wasn't the right moment, but suddenly that didn't seem to matter anymore. "I think we should put the wedding back by 6 months. The words just came out of her mouth, bubbling over like lava and every bit as unstoppable. "What? Are you telling me you don't want to get married?" "I'm not saying never. I'm just saying not now, not until we're sure." "We've been together 17 bloody years. How much longer do you need to be sure?" It was so unusual for Aaron to raise his voice that for a second Toni lost the power to speak. He was right. It sounded ridiculous when he said it like that. But it was time apart they needed. Time away from everyone's expectations and each other's, to be really sure this was right for them, and they weren't just marching like lemmings towards their fate. "I just need a bit of space. I think we both do, so we can be sure this is what we want." All the pre-prepared speech she'd practiced about why this could be so good for them had fallen out of her head. Even though she knew she wasn't conveying what she'd meant to say, she didn't seem to be able to put it right. "I don't need space, Toni. I know I love you. I always have." Aaron gave a shuddering sigh. "So you want to postpone the engagement party too? This is going to kill Mum." "No, it isn't!" She almost screamed the words this time. None of the things they were doing at his mother's bidding would kill her if they didn't do them. But it was as if Aaron had been brainwashed. This was going to be their whole life if she didn't make a stand. Judy would dictate where they lived, when they had a baby, what they called it, where they went on holiday. Every last part of their lives would be controlled by Aaron's mother, and it was almost like she was sitting on Toni's chest, controlling the amount of air she could get into her lungs. It wasn't enough. "Don't do this, Toni, please, not tonight. Mum's put so much effort into organising the party and she's so excited. We can talk about it afterwards. Please, just give her tonight." "Do you love me, Aaron?" "Yes, of course, No." She cut him off. She needed to know. "I mean, really love me, more than you love anyone else." "You know I do, but things with Mum make it complicated." Aaron sighed again. "Are you saying you don't love me? Is that why you don't want to get married?" "I do love you." She had to bite her lip to stop herself from adding the rest. The truth was, she wasn't even sure what the rest would be. "I do love you, but not like that," or "I do love you, but not enough to spend my whole life in your mother's shadow." Any of the ways of finishing the sentence would break Aaron's heart, and that was the last thing she wanted. She really did love him, and the one thing she was certain of was that she'd always want him in her life, no matter what. "I'd marry you tomorrow. You know that, don't you?" "Uh-huh." The problem was she didn't know why. "So we can go ahead with the party tonight and talk about the rest of it later?" He sounded almost desperate now, but all it was doing was convincing her she was right. He should have been desperate to find some sort of resolution with Toni, some way of reassuring her that everything would work out the way they wanted. But all of Aaron's desperation was targeted towards his mother getting the party she'd been planning, and nothing else really mattered, at least not as much. Toni was always going to come second, but worse than that, Aaron would always put himself last. If that's what you really want? Toni stared at one of the ambulances pulling into the hospital as she blinked back the tears that were threatening to spill out for no good reason. Nothing had changed in the last 5 minutes, except that she was certain now that something had to change, no matter how much it might hurt. What about this wedding list, then? Where shall I tell Mum we want it? Wherever you want. Her words sounded as empty as she felt, but they couldn't keep having this conversation and going round and round in circles. He wanted to put off talking about everything that mattered until after the party, and she could go along with that too, if she had to. Looking at her watch, Toni let out a long breath. She needed to be back on the ward in 5 minutes. Babies didn't wait for anyone. And she was more grateful than ever for the job that had never once made her question if she'd picked the right career. I'm really worried about you. You've been so different lately, and I just want you to be happy. Aaron's voice was strained, as if the tension of trying to please two such different women was literally pulling him in opposite directions. The only person Aaron should have been worrying about was himself, except he never would. It's nothing. Just a bit stressed with work and the wedding plans. We both are. We seem to be getting through paracetamol like we're running our own pharmacy lately. She wasn't going to tell Aaron the solution she'd come up with, not now. They needed to be face to face, to talk things through calmly, without the spectre of the engagement party looming over them. 200 people, most of whom she barely knew, with the catering and entertainment all decided by her mother-in-law to be. She had to get that out of the way first, before she even had a chance of persuading Aaron that her plan really could be the perfect solution for everyone. I think you're right. Aren't weddings supposed to be the most stressful things you can go through? I think that's divorce. They both laughed, and for a second she could almost picture the old Aaron, the one she'd fallen in love with. Either way, I can't seem to shift this headache. But if you really want me to, I'll talk to Mum before the party and see if I can get her to calm down a bit about everything when she's chatting to everyone tonight about the wedding plans, as if all the arrangements are already a done deal. No, don't worry. We can sort it all out after the party. Let your Mum have her night. I know how much she wants it. Toni held in the sigh that would have taken the final traces of air out of her lungs. She just needed to hold on for a little bit longer. Have a break this afternoon if you can. And maybe even see if you can get half an hour's sleep before the party. You've been half killing yourself, working and studying like you have, never mind the wedding. I've got to get back to work, but there's a box of the stronger painkillers in the bathroom cabinet. Take a couple more of those and hopefully you'll feel better soon. Although you might find it goes by itself once his party is out of the way. I'll be back by 6, so make sure you're not in the shower, because I'll need to jump in if I'm going to have time to get ready. I could always wait in there for you. That will be bound to make me feel better. Aaron was teasing her, but part of her was pulling away from him physically too. When you were suffocating, it turned out all your basic survival instincts kicked in and you'd do whatever it took to come up for air, even if that meant leaving someone else behind. I love you, Aaron Cunningham. You do know that, don't you? Loving him had always been the easy bit, and that would never change, no matter what. Of course I do, and I love you too. Aaron breathed out slowly. That's why I count to 10 every time Mum gets a bit too carried away with the wedding plans, because when it comes down to it, just like I said, I'd marry you tomorrow. I know you would. She couldn't bring herself to echo his words, even if leaving them hanging in the air felt cruel, like someone telling you they loved you and getting no response. As far as she knew, they'd never lied to each other, and she didn't want to start now. They just had to get through the party, and there'd be plenty of time to put the brakes on the wedding plans. She wanted 6 months, that was all, for both of them to be sure. And once she told him her plan, she was certain he'd see how perfect it was. If they were meant to be together, they'd know after that, and what was 6 months after all? They had all the time in the world. Toni's throat was burning. She was late, and there were no spaces in the car park outside the flats. Aaron's car was in the only bay reserved exclusively for them, and she'd missed the chance to nab one of the other communal ones. She had to leave her car in the community car park, almost half a mile away from the flat, because there were no spaces in the side roads nearby either. Having their engagement party on the weekend of the Silver of the Sea festival in August wouldn't have been Toni's choice. Port Agnes was rammed with visitors. But then Toni wouldn't have chosen to have a party at all. Despite that, the first thing she was going to do when she saw Aaron was to apologise to him. He didn't want a party either. He was just being his usual self and going along with it to make other people happy. For once in her life, she was going to try to be as good-hearted as Aaron and do the same thing. The best chance he had of enjoying the night was to believe she was even half as excited as his mother was. So she was going to channel her inner Judi Dench and give the performance of a lifetime. Because if anyone deserved a night off from all the tension there'd been lately, it was Aaron. The rest could wait. Except now she was running late for her own big night. She'd been held up with the delivery of a baby at the end of her shift, when one of the midwives on the night shift had called in sick and she'd had to cover until the other on-call midwife arrived. It would be a case of jumping straight into the shower, doing the best she could with her hair and makeup in the time she had, and ending up feeling even more uncomfortable as the centre of attention at the party than she already would have done. The words she wanted to say to Aaron after the party was over were all set out now, though. She'd run through them in her head at least 100 times over, and it all made perfect sense. For 6 months, they'd do their own thing, and if they still wanted to be together at the end of that, then they were obviously made for each other. It wasn't about dating other people, at least not from her point of view. It was about truly knowing their own minds. Toni would use the 6 months to go travelling, and Aaron could focus on finishing his masters. It would also mean he could spend every spare moment he wanted to with his mum before he settled down to family life. As far as Toni could see, it was the perfect solution for everyone. If she missed Aaron even half as much as she expected to, then she'd know he was the one for her. She was taking a big risk that he might realise he preferred life without her, but it was a price she was willing to pay for his happiness as well as her own. Aaron was never going to put himself first, so just this once she was going to do it for him. All they had to do was to get the party neither of them had asked for out of the way first. For God's sake! Toni was tempted to use a much stronger expletive as she shut the door of the flat behind her. All her good intentions about being Miss Sweetness and Light were going out of the window already. The sound of the shower running in the bathroom was immediately obvious. If he thought there was any chance of them spending some time in there together now, then he was sadly mistaken. Even if he still had shampoo to rinse out, he was going to have to get his butt out of the shower and do it under the kitchen tap. Her apology would have to wait until she didn't have the scent of disinfectant clinging to her skin, the way she always seemed to when she came back from work. "Aaron, come on. You know I haven't got that long," she called out as she pushed open the bathroom door. It was too steamy at first to see anything much at all. It must have had the shower almost too hot to stand under. Bloody hell, it's like a sauna in here. Even as she moved towards the shower, she still couldn't see him. It was shrouded in such a thick mist, the glass was almost opaque. "What on earth are you doing in there?" Pulling back the door, the words caught in her throat. Aaron was slumped down in the bottom of the shower, in such an odd position that it left no doubt in her mind that he wasn't just pulling some sort of prank. "Aaron, what's wrong? Get up!" Reaching out to grab his shoulder, Toni's hand was shaking. Despite the hot water cascading onto him, when she touched his skin, she knew it was already too late. The steamy air was instantly filled with the sound of screams. At first, she didn't even register that they were coming from her, until her legs gave out from under her. Aaron was gone. Chapter 1. 5 years later. There was an air of melancholy about September, even somewhere as beautiful as Port Agnes. The autumn sunsets arrived earlier than they had just weeks before, but the sea, which stretched out from the Cornish Atlantic coastline to beyond the horizon, was still relatively calm. Part of the sense of melancholy was down to the shortening days, and the leaves on the trees beginning to die in a blaze of rust and gold. But there was more to it than that, at least for Toni. 5 years after losing Aaron, September still marked the weeks following his death and the aftermath when Toni had finally started to accept he really wasn't coming back. At such a young age, there'd had to be an autopsy following Aaron's death. The result revealed he'd suffered a massive brain hemorrhage that they'd said would have been incredibly difficult to do anything about, even if the weakness in the blood vessels had been discovered in time, and which, mercifully, he wouldn't have known anything about either. Toni had lost her fiancé and her best friend in one devastating blow, and Judy and Simon Cunningham had lost their only child. All of them had lost the future they'd mapped out so carefully, if only in their heads. The funeral had eventually taken place in mid-September, and Aaron's mother had been so distraught that she'd had to be restrained from throwing herself onto his coffin as it was lowered into the ground in the churchyard of St. Jude's. The cakes that Judy had baked in the hope of convincing Reverend Sampson to squeeze in a Saturday wedding the following summer had instead been exchanged for a burial plot in the churchyard, where space was almost non-existent. Despite the fact that Aaron's parents lived in Port Tremelian, they wanted the funeral to be held in nearby Port Agnes, at the church where Toni and Aaron's wedding had been planned. It had given them all some comfort that Aaron's plot was on the side of the church that looked down into the town, where the flat he'd shared so briefly with Toni was just a few streets back from the harbour below it. Not that Toni really believed Aaron could see any of that with his own eyes, but it always gave her something to talk about when she went to see him. Nobody knew just how often that was, partly because she rarely talked about Aaron to anyone who hadn't known him in life. As close as she'd become to the other midwives in the 4 years she'd worked the Port Agnes midwifery unit, most of them didn't know she'd lost her fiancé the year before she'd started there. To them, she was just no-nonsense Toni, with sharp edges and just a hint of a soft side that only occasionally appeared, usually in support of a troubled, expectant mother or a woman in labour. Even when she'd accompanied her friends from the unit to the Silver of the Sea festival, which took place around the anniversary of Aaron's death each year, depending on when the bank holiday fell, she hadn't mentioned his name. There'd always be a get-together on the anniversary itself, with her parents and his, and that was painful enough, without having to talk her friends through what had happened, reliving it all over again. If the world thought she was cold, better that than constant inquiries about whether she was okay. She couldn't afford to peel back the layer of armour she'd built up after Aaron's death to check. She'd had to be the strong one, holding it together for Judy and Simon and her own parents. She didn't know how long she had stayed slumped by the shower tray before she found the strength to call 999, or to phone Aaron's parents and tell them that their beloved only son was gone. His mother had gone to the flat only moments after the ambulance. The paramedics confirmed what Toni had known the moment she'd reached out to touch him. It didn't stop a hysterical Judy begging them to keep trying to bring her boy back, beating her fists against the chest of one of the poor paramedics when she realised there was nothing he could do except take Aaron away. Toni had wanted, with all her heart, to undo the words she'd said to Aaron that afternoon on the phone. Words that might have left him in any doubt about how much she loved him. Seeing him lying there, with all life extinguished, she'd have done anything to bring him back. There was no way of easing Judy's pain that Toni felt acutely responsible for causing. Maybe if she hadn't added to his stress in the run-up to the engagement party, he'd have had a chance to get to the doctor. But thinking like that was the road to hell. All she could do was promise Aaron that she'd do whatever it took to make things as bearable as they could be without him for his mum and dad. He'd spent the last 7 years of his life focused on making his mum's every wish come true, and it was Toni's turn to take on that mantle. The next time Toni had seen Aaron was the night before the funeral, in the chapel of rest at the undertaker's. Part of her hadn't wanted to go, but Judy had desperately needed her, and it had been the start of Toni trying her best to fill Aaron's shoes, putting herself at the bottom of the pile to make everyone else's feelings her priority, just the way he'd always done. He looks so peaceful, doesn't he? Judy had given Toni a watery smile that definitely didn't reach her eyes. Forcing herself to nod in response, she'd stared down at Aaron. He looked as though he was wearing a mask, and peaceful wasn't the term she'd have used to describe him. But Judy had needed to hear the words. He does. I'm so glad the two of you got engaged before this happened, but it breaks my heart, almost as much as losing Aaron, that you've already lost the love of your life. So young. Judy had reached out, her tears plopping down to the place where their hands were joined. Promise me that we won't lose you two, Toni. We couldn't bear it. Of course you won't. Mandy, Toni's mother, had taken the words out of her mouth before she'd even had a chance to reply. She's never going to find someone like Aaron again, and we're all going to miss him so much, but we've got to stick together. I can't stand the thought of anything changing, and Aaron not being around to see it. Judy's body was racked by a heaving sob. Seeing you with someone else would have broken his heart, but I... Don't even think like that. Whatever Judy had been about to say, Toni had cut it off. Talking about moving on after Aaron's death wasn't something she'd even wanted to think about back then, any more than Judy had. She hadn't realised just how big a promise she was making, though, because at that point she could never have envisaged meeting someone who would make her want to break that promise. What she'd agreed to in that chapel of rest was effectively to freeze time. She was Aaron's fiancée, and that's what she'd always be. The last time she'd seen Judy had been at Aaron's anniversary dinner, marking the 5 years without him. As usual, she joined her father, Steve, and her mother at Judy and Simon's house in Port Tremelian, just along the coast from Port Agnes, right next door to her parents' own house. As always, Judy had made a buffet with all of Aaron's favourite things, and Toni had been tasked with carrying the platters from the kitchen to the dining room. She'd been on her way back to collect the last platter when she'd heard her mother and Judy talking, and she'd paused outside the kitchen door. It's so sad that Toni hasn't been able to move on after losing Aaron, but then she was never going to find someone like him again. Her mother's tone conveyed an odd mixture of sadness and conciliation. I know it's selfish, but part of me has always been very glad that Toni's never found someone else. The thought of her having other in-laws is almost unbearable. It's... Hello, sweetheart, what are you doing loitering here? Her father had come up behind her, almost making her jump out of her skin and drowning out the conversation Judy had been having with her mother. He shuttled her into the kitchen and put an end to her eavesdropping. Not that it would have revealed anything she didn't already know. She belonged to Judy and Simon Cunningham for life. She'd made that promise when she got engaged to their son and when she'd reassured Aaron's mother after he'd died that nothing would ever change that. The fact that there was someone else in her life now was a secret she hugged close. She hadn't meant to fall in love with Bobby, but the harder she'd fought against it, the less she'd been able to resist. What amazed her most was that someone like him wanted to be with someone like her in the first place, even if she hadn't had enough baggage to overload a luggage carousel in an airport terminal. He was young and effortlessly attractive, with honey-coloured skin and the mix of kindness and tenacity any man would need to get through midwifery training and the sort of judgments that came with that. She might barely recognise the person she'd become since Aaron had died, but she still had the same mid-length, mid-brown bob she'd had for almost her whole life, and it was only really when she was with Bobby that she saw any sparkle in the eyes that matched her hair, a nondescript shade of brown, so unlike Bobby's dark brown eyes which shone with warmth. He was way out of her league, and she knew it. The oddest thing was that he seemed to think it was the other way round, but he must have been about the only person in the world who'd agree. It couldn't be what she'd had with Aaron anyway, because she'd never be able to tell the 4 people she considered to be her parents about his existence. Bobby wasn't going to be content with staying a secret forever, though, and in truth they were already on the brink. But she could never choose him, knowing it would break Judy and Simon's hearts all over again. She'd just have to take the blows when the time came. After all, she was the strong one, and putting her needs behind theirs had become second nature. Until Bobby had come along. "Where are you?" The voice on the other end of the line sounded breathy and panicked, even though Toni had answered her phone on the second ring, using the hands-free function in her car. "Just parking outside the unit. What's up?" Toni pulled the car to a halt and waited for an answer from Anna, one of her closest friends, who also happened to be her boss and who had recently discovered she was pregnant. "I'm spotting, and I wondered if you could check me over, if you got time before your first clinic." Anna had told Toni on their last shift together that she was only a few days away from her 12-week scan. They both knew it was the milestone all pregnant women wanted to get to in order to start believing that everything was going to be okay. At 39, and with this being her first pregnancy, Anna was higher risk than most and categorized as a geriatric mother. Not that Toni would have used that term, especially given that the most fitting description would have been miraculous. Not long before her wedding, Anna had been told she had the fertility of a woman in her mid-40s and had been prescribed a fertility drug as a last-ditch attempt to fall pregnant. She'd been warned she was facing very long odds, but had decided to give it one last shot before embarking on an adoption journey with her husband, Bray. The couple's discovery, the day after their wedding, that Anna was pregnant, had been a thrill for all the midwives at the unit, who were in unanimous agreement that they had the best boss in the world. All of which meant that the prospect of Anna losing her miracle pregnancy was making the skin on the back of Toni's neck prickle. Facing up to the prospect that she might have to be the one to confirm Anna's worst fears, she swallowed hard. The least she could do was to be there for her friend. "Of course, where are you?" Toni had an hour before her first clinic, but she wouldn't have hesitated either way. For once, the other patients would just have to wait. "I'm already in consulting room 3. I'm terrified of trying the Doppler out on my own." Anna's voice caught on the words. "What if I can't hear anything?" "I'll be 2 minutes. It's going to be okay." Toni disconnected the call and grabbed her bag, offering up a quick prayer to whatever deity might be listening that she was right. There was a team of midwives at the unit, but she was particularly close to Anna, Ella, and Jess, the 4 of them forming a really close bond over the past 2 years, since Ella had joined the team. So it was no surprise that Anna wanted Toni to be there to support her, especially as Ella was out on home visits and Jess had the day off. It was always nerve-wracking examining a woman who was fearful that they might be losing their baby, but when it was one of your best friends, the prospect was absolutely terrifying. "How you doing?" Toni forced herself into the no-nonsense mode that she was so well known for, acting as if she had no doubt that everything was going to be okay, despite the fact that nausea was swirling in her stomach. "Does Bray know you're here?" "He's on his way up." Anna bit her lip. "I didn't want to worry him at first, as I thought the spotting might stop straight away, but there's still a bit." "How much?" Toni was already rolling paper out onto the examination table, speaking deliberately so Anna wouldn't hear any wobble in her voice. The last thing she needed was for Toni to add to her panic. Normally, she wouldn't use a Doppler to listen to a baby's heartbeat until the mother-to-be was in her second trimester, when there was almost a guarantee of hearing it. The heartbeat could be picked up as early as 8 weeks, though, and with Anna just shy of 12, Toni was pretty confident that she'd be able to hear something, assuming everything was okay. The bleeding was nothing major, but enough to scare the hell out of me. Anna shivered, and Toni briefly touched her arm. She wasn't one for hugs or any overt displays of affection as a rule, but sometimes she let her arm slip just enough to break the habit she'd developed over the years, in a desperate attempt to keep a lid on her feelings. "Any cramps?" Her voice was falsely breezy, but all she could do was hope that staying as professional as possible was helping. She had to get as much information as possible from Anna either way. "Nothing new, but I've had what feels like period pains on and off ever since I found out I was pregnant, which I put down to pregnancy starting to stretch my prehistoric uterus." Anna tried to laugh, but it sounded slightly maniacal, and then she bit her lip again. "I just hope it hasn't let me down." "Try not to worry. Let's get you checked out first and see what this baby is up to." Toni felt a bit of a hypocrite when she could sense her own pulse quickening. Telling Anna not to worry was like trying to hold back the sea in circumstances like this. And just as Toni was helping her onto the examination table, Anna's phone started to ring. "It's Bray." She looked at Toni before answering the call. "Hello? Yes, we're inside. Toni's just going to check me over. If you come to the delivery doors, one of us will let you in." "No, don't worry. I'm fine. I'm sure it's going to be okay." "Yes, I know. Okay. I love you too." Listening to the one-sided conversation, Toni's shoulders relaxed just a little. Whatever her examination of Anna uncovered, Bray would be there to support his wife. Everyone knew Anna and Bray were a couple. You couldn't say one of their names without thinking about their other half. It was the same with Ella and her fiancé Dan. And once upon a time, it had been the same with Toni and Aaron. It had been so deeply rooted in her identity and such a part of who she was that the first year after he died, she'd found it hard to sign Christmas or birthday cards without automatically adding his name. "I'll go and let Bray in. You get yourself as comfortable as you can and try to relax." Toni gave Anna a half smile, knowing she was asking the impossible. Anna just needed an answer, her hands visibly shaking despite the warmth of the consultation room. The fact that she'd asked Bray to use the delivery entrance obviously meant she didn't want Vivian, their new receptionist, to know there might be an issue with the baby. If the worst-case scenario was true and the baby was already gone, Anna and Bray were going to have to find a way to process it themselves before they shared the news with everyone else. The last thing Anna would want was everyone jumping to conclusions or second-guessing what was going on. Toni knew from bitter experience that it was possible to hold it all together in the toughest of times, up until the point when someone asked if you were okay, and that's when it all fell apart. It was part of why she'd grown a hard shell over the years, so no one ever felt the need to ask her that question. But Anna wore her emotions on her sleeve at the best of times, and the fact that everyone at the unit loved her would make their well-intentioned inquiries inevitable. All of which meant that Toni was almost as happy to see Bray as Anna would be. "Oh, Toni, thank God you were around to see her." Bray gave her one of his trademark hugs. He was a big bear of a man, but so kind and gentle that not even Toni could protest. Not that he'd have given her a chance, anyway. "Is she okay?" "She's fine, apart from being a bit worried, but the spotting is probably nothing. It happens to a lot of women, and Anna's pregnancy was always likely to be a bit more demanding at her grand old age." Toni winked, guessing that the best thing for Bray was to stay upbeat and that he recognised it as a joke. If she was honest, she needed to keep things light-hearted every bit as much as he did. She couldn't even bear to think about how she'd handled things if the news wasn't good. "Don't let her hear you say that, or she'd put you on call for nights for the next 6 months." Bray managed a brief smile before they hurried back down the corridor to his wife. Whatever the outcome, they needed to know. "Sorry if I made you panic." Anna's voice was muffled as Bray wrapped his arms around her. "I wanted you to be here to hear the heartbeat for the first time if everything's okay, but I also wanted you to be here if it isn't. It's going to be okay. We've got Toni here and everyone knows she's unflappable. And the other bit of good news is that you got me out of peeling about 1/2 ton of potatoes in preparation for tonight." Bray ran Penrose Place, an award-winning fish and chip shop down by the harbour, which was famous for miles around, and he was following Toni's lead and keeping things light. "Right, let's see where this little one is hiding, shall we?" Toni silently willed the sound of her own heartbeat pulsating in her ears to quieten down as she squirted some gel onto Anna's stomach, moving the Doppler across the bump that was already putting in an appearance. First pregnancies usually took longer to show, but this was another likely side effect of being an older, expectant mother. Everything was a bit less elastic than it was in younger women. Toni just hoped it was a good sign that the baby was still in there and growing as it should be, too. "Can you hear that?" Bray had a grin that could have lit up the whole of Port Agnes as the reassuring rhythm of the baby's heart came through loud and clear, and Toni would have happily high-fived him if she hadn't been holding the Doppler. Now it was her turn to bite her lip to stop herself from crying, even as her whole body seemed to slump with relief that the baby's heartbeat was not only loud and clear, but had also been incredibly easy to find. "Oh, thank God, Toni, you're a star." Anna was grinning too, and Bray kissed the top of her head, the relief in the room tangible. "I was so glad it was you here to check me over. I don't think I could have coped with Ella and Jess bursting into tears on me before we even knew what was going on. You know me, cool as a cucumber." No one would ever know that Toni's heart had been racing as hard as it had, and Bray nearly knocked the Doppler out of her hands to give her another hug, his face wreathed in smiles as he pulled away again. "So everything's definitely okay." "It sounds perfect, but if you're still worried and you don't want to wait until next week, there's always the early pregnancy unit." Toni was smiling too. It had been much easier to find the baby's heartbeat than she'd expected, especially as Anna was still in the first trimester, and the fact that it was so clear really was the best of signs. "Shall we have another listen?" "Yes, please. It's already my favourite sound in the world." Anna laughed, as Toni immediately located the heartbeat in exactly the same place as she'd found it first time around. Sliding the Doppler back towards her, though, she suddenly stopped, her eyes widening as she heard the heartbeat again. Moving it 2 inches in the other direction, the sound disappeared. But when she pushed it another 2 inches further in that direction, she picked up the heartbeat again. "What's wrong?" Bray had spotted the expression that had crossed Toni's face before she'd been able to stop it. Even someone as practiced as she couldn't always hide their emotions, and right now they were bubbling really close to the surface. "I know your uterus is still only the size of a large orange right now, but either this baby is a proper little athlete, bouncing from one side to the other, or—" Anna looked at her eyes widening exactly as Toni's had. "Or what? What's going on?" Bray looked from Toni to Anna and back again. "Or the two of you are expecting double trouble." For once, Toni couldn't stop her emotions bubbling over, laughing at the expressions that crossed Bray's face in rapid succession as he turned to his wife, who was nodding and half laughing, half crying. "They did say there was always a slight risk of this with the fertility drugs I was taking." Anna was shaking her head, a big smile on her face, even as the tears started rolling down her cheeks. "I thought I was just getting really fat really quickly." "You better go down to the early pregnancy unit and get a scan to be sure, but if I was a betting woman, I'd say it was twins." Toni looked at Bray again, trying to guess whether he could take one more joke. "Although I suppose there's always a chance there could be 3 in there." "Budge over, Anna. I think I need to lie down." Bray was grinning, despite his words. And when he folded Toni into yet another of his bear hugs, she didn't even try to resist. Sometimes it was hard watching other people get all the things she'd have had by now if Aaron had lived, whether it was with him or someone else. But not today. Today, all she felt was pure joy for 2 of the nicest people she knew. Twins might be double trouble, but if anyone had enough love to handle that kind of instant family, it was Anna and Bray. Chapter 2. Bobby was getting used to the fact that he was now a fully qualified midwife, but it was some of the patients who had the most difficulty with it. No one seemed to have any issue with male doctors, but a male midwife still left quite a few of them open-mouthed. He was due to start going out on rounds, but he'd asked Anna to pair him with another of the team for the first visits to any patients he hadn't seen before in case they refused to be examined by him. The last thing he wanted was anything important to be missed at one of the checkups just because he didn't have the same anatomical makeup as his patients. For most of his 27 years, Bobby had lived with his parents, Joyce and Scott. But in the last year or so of his training, still juggling everything on a maternity care assistant's salary, he'd finally been able to move into a tiny studio flat in one of the narrow lanes that snaked uphill from the harbour at Port Agnes. Not that he hadn't loved living with his parents and never having to worry about having enough money to pay the rent and still be able to afford a pint of milk. But there came a time when you had to strike out, even if he hadn't really been able to stretch to it at the time. His mates had enough fun taking the mickey out of his career choice without the opportunity to call him a mama's boy too. Now that he was finally qualified, he might even be able to pay the rent and afford to fully stock his fridge. If things had been different, he'd have liked to suggest getting a place with Toni, now that he could pay his way. But he had more chance of his mates not ripping a strip off him for being a midwife than he did of that happening. Looking across the staff room at her now, she had her bob-length hair tied back into a short ponytail, like she'd had when they'd last had the chance to spend some time together. She'd been cooking for them at her flat, and he'd walked up behind her, putting his arms around her and kissing the back of her neck. Just ordinary stuff that other couples did on a daily basis. But he could never do that where anyone else might see. Not that he ever would while they were at work, but it would be nice to be able to reach out and touch her arm in public without her jumping like she'd been stung by a wasp. The other midwives in the team must have known there was something going on between him and Toni, and for a little while he thought she might finally stop trying to hide it. But then there'd been the run-up to Aaron's anniversary, and she closed right down again. He hadn't even seen her since she'd been to their annual get-together that Aaron's parents always hosted, but he could feel her pulling